Hello everyone. Welcome to our webinar on French property, visas and tax, sponsored by Blevins Franks. My name's Karen Tate, and for the past 20 years I've been editing French property news and attending our French property exhibitions. I'm joined today by our experts, Peter Wakelin of Blevins Franks, Diana Niegesh of French Connections HCB, and Pauline Johnson of Beauvillage Estate Agency. We'll start with some information from each of them about what they do, and then we'll move on to the questions you've already sent in. You'll also be able to submit questions while we're live, and apologies if we don't get round to answering all of your questions, but you can get in touch with us via email afterwards. We'll also have a couple of polls running during the webinar, and the webinar will be recorded and sent to you afterwards in case you've missed anything or would like to watch it again. So over to Peter now.
Thank you, Karen, for the introduction. As I say, I'm a partner with Blevins Franks based at the Bergerac office. My key function is to provide financial planning advice to largely UK nationals who are either already resident in France or those considering becoming resident. What we look to do is provide all-round financial planning advice with the key messages of trying to seek means of mitigation of French taxes, but also importantly, inheritance rules and the ultimate tax liability for your heirs. Importantly, given the complexities of a different tax system and a different inheritance system, we do recommend, where possible, to seek advice ahead of moving to France. Because we don't have much time today, what I would also indicate is take a look at the Blevins Franks website on the French page, because we do have numerous download guides there, which we hope you might find useful additional information in addition to today. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. Diana. Well, Diana, I think you're still on mute. Think you're okay now? Should we just go over to Pauline instead while Diana sorts out her microphone? So Pauline, please.
Okay, sorry, it was the common setup.
Oh, okay.
Here we go. But please go ahead, Pauline, and I will go after.
All right. Pauline Johnson. I work with Beauvillage Estate Agency. We specialise in property purchases for both French and international clients. We have high street shops, and we're also very active on the internet base. We're the sole associates for Savills for the southwest of France, which means that we have property prices that can vary from 20,000 for a small parcel of land up to many millions for a chateau.
Lovely, thank you, Pauline. And Diana?
So good afternoon, I'm Diana, and I'm working at French Connection HCB as a relocation specialist. You should think of our company as your one-stop administration partner in France. We can help you with every aspect of your move and then make sure that things go smoothly when you arrive. What we can take care of is all different administrative procedures such as visa, residency application, healthcare, car registration, driving license exchanges, and of course, many more.
Lovely, thank you, Diana. We'll start off with you, Diana, because we've had lots of questions about how Brexit has affected the amount of time Brits can spend in France now. Could you explain a little about how things have changed, including the 90 and 180 days rule? And how can people stay in France for longer than 90 days now? And what's the longest they can stay in France with a visa?
Sure, I understand that the new rules are absolutely confusing, and many people, especially when they have access to social media with all the waste of information, is just like, oh my God, what's going on? So when you come as a tourist, or if you come to enjoy your secondary home, or you stay much longer because you have your well-deserved, savings to spend in here, or would like to retire, all the time frames are different. But the longest that you can stay in France with a visa is up to 1 year. In terms of the 90 per 180 day rule, it's the easiest to think about is actually to start to count backwards. So when you are planning to come to France, you have to look at it if in the past 180 days, how many days you have spent in France, and it cannot exceed 90 days. Obviously, this 90 per 180 day, it's only applicable for those people who are planning to come as a tourist or occasionally enjoy their secondary home. By any chance, if there is any confusion, of course, just please let us know, and then we all can guide you through that.
Lovely, thank you, Diana. And I think it's also worth noting that on the Schengen website, people can find a calculator for the amount of days you spend in France. You just put in the day you arrive, and that's quite helpful for some people to keep track.
Absolutely, and then they have to look at it that the 90 per 180 rule is for the whole Schengen area, actually, not just for France.
Yes, of course. Thank you. Pauline, someone has asked us, can Brits still buy a house in France post-Brexit? And what is the process for buying a house? And how long does it generally take?
Yes, Brits can still buy in France. The process really is the same. The length of time from when you have an offer accepted would usually be between 3 to 4 months. We try and help at all stages of that in terms of trying to collate any missing information on the property, help you with agreeing a price, collating information for the notaires, asking for proof of funds, which you would be required to produce, ID, we'd get the diagnostics organised, all those sort of things. And then you would move to the compromis, which the notaire prepares. Once the notaire has prepared the compromis and you sign it, you have 10 days to change your mind. And usually at this point, the 10% deposit is required. Once the 10 days has passed, you are locked in unless certain terms of the compromis were not met. And usually from that point, you'd be looking at about 2 months until the final signing took place. So if you estimate between 3 to 4 months, you should be okay.
Okay, lovely. And the compromis de vente, the first sales contract, that's signed quite early on in the process, isn't it? Unlike in the UK where we exchange at the end. So you're tied in legally quite early on.
Absolutely that. So once an agreement is made on a price, it could be days, it could be a couple of weeks before the compromis was signed. But yes, once that is signed, you are tied into that property.
Lovely. So no gazumping, which is great news for buyers and vendors too. You know where you are. Okay, lovely. A tax question now for Peter. Have French tax rules changed for holiday homeowners since Brexit? And that's been asked both as an owner staying there and for renting out your property.
Whilst taxes are always possible to change at any time, these are largely due, though, to budgetary changes at a local level. Brexit itself had little or no impact on any of the changes with regards not only the tax rules, but also the tax liabilities on things, because those are all governed by tax treaties, which didn't form party to anything to do with the negotiations and Brexit. Just briefly then, in explaining what that basically means from a person looking at wanting to let either their property or attaching JEETs. And it's slightly different if you're a resident or non-resident. Just looking at non-resident from a perspective to start off with, you have an obligation as a non-resident to still file a French tax return as a non-resident, declaring the rental income as furnished let property rental. This actually is not bad of a deal, because you actually benefit a simplified system where you declare the gross value, and at which point then the system automatically provides a reduction against that up to between 50 and 71%. So in reality to it, you then get the difference that becomes taxable at marginal tax rates. And assuming little or other actually taxes or liability for other income sources, the liability will be relatively small, if anything. Importantly, however, they also will look to apply a new type of tax that's applied, and this is a 7.5%, what we call solidarity tax now. We'll mention more about this slightly later. The only difference between that and if you then become resident, you can still declare it in exactly the same way as just mentioned, but the other option is to possibly consider operating the letting business within some form of a French business activity. Most commonly, ultra-entrepreneur is regularly used, that can provide some benefits because there are sometimes lower tax liabilities that are fixed using the auto entrepreneur route. It's a case of looking at which one may or may not be the best suitable for yourself as part of when you consider residency at that time.
Okay, lovely. So it's good to know that Brexit hasn't changed the tax rules, so it makes it maybe slightly less complicated, and good to know that Brexit hasn't changed the house buying process at all. Obviously, it has changed moving to France. And Diana, someone has asked, how has Brexit affected a permanent move to France? How easy is it to obtain residency now? And is there a difference between moving to France to retire or to work?
I know that for many people, the fact that they need a visa from now and to have the residency in France or permanently settle in France is quite scary. But you should think about it, that how many millions of people have been doing it successfully before. So rest assured that it is actually possible. You have to make sure that you're following the right route, however, to come to France. You need to have a necessary visa. That visa needs to be validated once you are here in France. And then after, you will be able to apply for the residency when the right time comes, which is actually 2 months before your visa is about to expire. As everybody's situation is different, when we are looking at someone who is ready to retire here in France, they can come with a long stay visitor visa without any problem, obviously they don't want to work in here. However, it is very different when somebody likes to work, they are being hired in here, or they would like to set up a business in here. They will need to have the right type of permit, a work permit, the right type of qualification, the right type of a diploma, business plan quite often, and obviously also the sufficient funds that will be able to help them to support themselves and the company that they are setting up in here.
Lovely, great. Thanks, Diana. Your microphone seems slightly strange then. I don't know if you were covering it or moving away, but your voice came in and out a little bit, just maybe to check before your next question. Pauline, a question for you now about costs when you're buying a property. We've been asked, what costs are there on top of the property price in terms of taxes, fees, and is there anything else people should be aware of?
Good question. If you're buying through an agent, then normally property adverts will include the agency fees. If it doesn't include it, then it should state it somewhere on there. So you should be clear whether it's included or not. If it's included, then the only additional cost you would have would be the notaire's fees. And we reckon that you should really set aside 8%, and that would cover you for the notaire's fees, of which about 75% of that is for the equivalent of stamp duty. All notaires change the same, so shopping around for a different notaire wouldn't necessarily change anything. In France, you pay taxe foncière, which is equivalent to council tax. And again, it would depend on the time of year when you purchased. Whoever is in a property on the 1st of January pays the full taxe foncière. So you would have a slight additional cost, which would be a pro rata for the amount of time that you would then own the property for that year. But other than that, it's just normal removal costs. So it's the notaire and a taxe foncière. Right
here, lovely. And it's interesting that what's referred to as the notaire's fees, actually only a proportion of that is the notaire's actual fees, isn't it? As you say, it's stamp duty, it's taxes as well, which the notaire collects on behalf of the state. Okay, great. Peter, it's quite a big question we've been asked. What are the tax implications of retiring to France, and are they the same Europe-wide?
Well, whilst it might be a big question, we can keep it really to the point in answering it. That's a good thing. First and foremost, taxes in France are governed by the French tax law and budgets. Each country, be it Spain, Portugal, or wherever else in Europe, have their own rules and different liabilities. So actually moving to France will have different tax implications compared to most other European countries. So that's a nice, easy one to start with. But looking at the implications directly about moving to France, let's keep it nice and simple in the first instance. As a tax resident, you will have an obligation to declare your global worldwide sources of income. on a French tax return, with them all then becoming liable for tax. Importantly, there is then something called a double tax treaty comes into play between France and mainly the UK. That means that certain sources of income will, however, though, benefit a tax credit because they will remain always liable for tax in the UK. Such things as certain types of occupational schemes, UK rental income, for example. The overall position, though, in reference to the tax implication as a whole, in most instances, and I say most, the actual liability in France is comparable, and if not lower, than the UK from a tax perspective, purely because of the tax system in France being more favourable, which sometimes is a bit of a surprise to most people. The other key tax that's always important to have to consider, which is again is different compared to the UK, is around inheritance, not only just the rules, but in terms of how the inheritance tax is then applied. In simple terms, it's determined by your relationship to who you bequeath your assets to, and that will really make a big difference in terms of what the rate and the actual liability is. And the other key point is it's those that benefit your estate who have to pay the tax, not from the estate. So by definition, what we're really saying here, it's really important to take planning, because without doing so, what you could inadvertently be doing without taking right planning is making the French government your ultimate senior beneficiary of your estate. So key message, planning is the key.
Fantastic, thanks, Peter. Diana, back to visas. What is the actual process for applying for a long stay visa? And then how would you start the process to gain permanent residency?
So the process itself starts online on the French government visa application website, where you will need to create your personal space and you will have to fill out all the information. Where sometimes people go wrong, that they think that it's actually immediately creating an interview appointment with the TLS Visa Center for you. Unfortunately, it's not. So you will have to make sure that you are and you book an appointment for yourself with the TLS Visa Center itself as well. Once you have your visa and you were able to come to France, you will have to get your visa validated with the Office of Integration and Immigration. It's an online platform, a globalized online platform, but eventually they are the one who are going to be treating your file. It has to be done 2 months before, 2 months after that you have actually arrived to France. After that, the next deadline that it's worth to keep in mind is that once your visa is about to expire, 2 months before it's expiring, that's the moment when you will be able to apply for your residency permit. That's actually quite a straightforward route from the visa and to the residency permit, because the long stay visitor visa is already sort of like a residency itself as well. The residency permit, you won't have to go back to the UK. You will be able to apply for it here in France at your local prefecture, which are the officials who are taking care of all these processes for you.
Great, thank you, Diana. And we do have lots of information about the visa process on our website, completefrance.com, which people can go to that afterwards. Pauline, we've got a buying question now related to location. What regions are best for climate without extremes of temperature?
France is a big country, so our advice really, if people are not already decided on their location, is to come and holiday over here, drive around, get a feel for the area that they think they're interested in. There's a huge variation in temperatures and landscape. If you're looking for a business, then you need something that has perhaps got travel links that are important. I live down in the Aude, so one of the furthest south departments, and we still have the 4 seasons. So we'll still have a bit of frost occasionally in winter. I think the difference is that the winters are milder, they're shorter, they're brighter. But do your research, because again, in the summer, you know, down here can get very, very hot, and we have people who find it is too overpowering. So it depends on what you're looking for, but I would definitely, again, do your research, and wherever possible, try and come on holiday and see if that area you think you like will suit you.
Absolutely lovely, and also good advice is to visit an area in different seasons so that people, you know, so you're not just experiencing it in the summer. People can look on the French weather website, which is meteo.fr, and that has lots of information on there about the different regions and areas. But do also bear in mind that they are regional sort of averages, and temperatures, weather conditions can change from one side of a valley to another. So again, research, I think, is the answer, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely, is research. Research.
Thank you. Peter, a quick question for you now. Well, quick for me to read out. What are the taxes on a UK pension?
Okay, I'm moving to France and becoming a French tax resident. Most occupational pensions, all private pension arrangements, and including the UK state pension, all become liable for declaration and tax in France. This is actually more regularly a positive, as we indicated not so many minutes ago, and that's because of the French tax system. For a start, formalised couples file a single household tax return, and therefore there is 2 effective zero rate bands being applied. There's also in France more tax bands comparably than the UK. So the net benefit overall is you get more of your income taxed at lower rates as compared to the UK. In addition to the tax liability, though, pensions also then subject to French social charges, potentially, at a rate of 9.1%. Why I say potentially is if you hold an S1 form or are not affiliated to the French health system, you are exempt from that social charge liability. What's also key to remember, though, of course, is because they become liable to French tax, it's important that these various occupational schemes, private arrangements, are then also taken out of the UK tax system, because otherwise you could inadvertently be suddenly getting taxed twice on the same sources of income. That's a process that is arranged after you become resident. Now, the only other exception to this general rule is certain types of occupational schemes, and these are what they call government UK occupational schemes, such like as teachers, civil service, the military and the like. Those will always remain liable, excuse me, to tax in the UK. You still, however, have to declare them, as we indicated earlier, but you then benefit a tax credit with them remaining liable for UK tax. The negative, however, being the fact that you have to declare them, is that they use up, unfortunately, part of your zero rate tax band, and it has the impact of potentially pushing other taxable income into a slightly higher tax band than already would be the case. So whilst not taxed on them themselves, they inadvertently can cause an actually increased tax liability. That's not specific or peculiar to France. All tax offices, be they UK, France, Spain, or elsewhere, use that same sort of process because of the double tax treaty rules.
Great, thank you, Peter. Diana, does a long stay visa give you access to healthcare and social services in France?
Not automatically. So this is not an automatic process. You will have to apply it for once you have been here in France for at least 3 months, and preferably you have 3 months worth of utility bills under your name. Technically, after it's a very, very long process. It can take up to 1 year. Different steps comes with it. So usually having a professional is very much advised to guide you through this whole thing, especially because the process is relatively all in French. When we are looking at the long stay visitor visa, however, you also have to think about the fact that you will need to have a private health insurance that comes with it. And that private health insurance will be able to stop depending on what type of insurance you have, of course, once you receive your social security number. So it is in your interest in a certain way to get it as fast as possible.
Fantastic. Thanks, Diana. It's now time for our first poll, which should be appearing on your screens now. Yep, there it is. Give you a minute to answer that. Lovely. Pauline, a buying question. Do you need to have a French bank account before you buy a property? The person who's asking the question has a British account which offers a Euro account with an IBAN number. And someone else has said, do you still need a French account if you purchase in cash?
The answer is you don't specifically need a French account in order to purchase over here. Again, Beauvillage, we have always used Smart Financial Exchange Company, and so you can directly transfer money from the UK into Smart, and they will pay the notaire. So at the point of purchase, you can you do not need a French bank account. What I would say is that once moving forward and you have the property, you would require a French bank account because you'd need it for applying for healthcare and various other utilities and things. So in the first instance, not essential, but pretty soon afterwards you would need one.
Lovely, great, thank you very much. Peter, we've covered visas and how long you can spend in France, but someone else has asked, what's the best way to spend as much time in France without having to move their tax footprint?
Yeah, without going over the things about visas again, because that's already been indicated. The answer to the question with regards tax and your tax residency is actually determined by the rules that are shown in the double tax treaty. There's a specific first section in there, gives the criteria. And whilst there's a number of them, what more commonly is the determining factor for many is about, do you spend or not more than 183 days or in France more than any other country? So the key message there is if you actually spend more than 183 days, or in fact spend more time in France than any other country, the French authorities at that point would have a claim to say that you have become French tax resident, and as a consequence, have an obligation to then start filing French tax returns. So there's your starting dates and timeline about whether you do or don't want to become deemed to be French tax resident. What I would say though, by planning it, actually moving your French residents to become tax resident in France is not necessarily a bad thing. And that's again about seeking the proper advice.
Great, thank you very much, Peter. And that, of course, has always been the same case before Brexit and post-Brexit in terms of how long you spend in one country or the other. But the difference now being people's passports being stamped, so it's clear when you are in.
Yeah, and that is really important because they are being checked now, and the Schengen area have introduced now an integrated passport control system as well. So where it was probably easier to be going in and outside of Spain to France and elsewhere and avoiding that potentially. I think that's now almost impossible to be dealing with. So time in France or any other Schengen area is now counted. So be careful. Otherwise, you might inadvertently be seen to become resident of a country without doing the planning. And that's probably the worst thing you could want to be doing.
Yeah, good point. Thank you. Diana, does owning a property give you access to residency or a visa? And are there any benefits to buying a property first and then applying for residency, or vice versa?
Unfortunately, owning a property does not give per se a residency or a visa to anyone. However, it greatly helps. Why? Because first, you will need to have an address in France to be able to apply for the visa. And secondly, because it puts your application into a much stronger position. So yes, I would say that if somebody can plan ahead and do that they going to purchase a property in advance, that definitely is a move that can help the application.
Okay, thank you. Pauline, lots of British people and other nationalities are interested in running gîtes in France. And we've been asked, what's the perfect size, facilities and location for a holiday home or gîte to rent out? And what would be a good yield?
I think for any gîte business, location is going to be crucial. I mentioned before about good transport links, so proximity to airports, proximity to motorways. Also for places of interest close by, there's no point in having a property that really is quite remote and difficult for people to get to and nothing around it. So try to have places of interest that are close by. So select carefully if you're wanting to have a good occupancy level. If you don't know the region that well, then again, ask your agent for some advice on this. Spend time to have a look round, see what the competitors are offering and doing. And the other thing I would say, as somebody who's had gîtes in the past, is don't underestimate the amount of work that's involved with gîtes. Having 2 or 3 changeovers all on one day within a 4 or 6 hour window is quite challenging at times. And equally, if you're using a management company, that will take, you will need to be paying them. So that will take some of the budget from you. Not everyone is looking for a pool, so it doesn't have to be a property that has a pool. But certainly, again, it's popular, and you would gain more tourists by doing that. But remember, for gîtes, you know, all budgets can be catered for, whether it's quite a plain, simple one or something that is quite top of the range. And in terms of what you could expect to gain as a form of investment with a yield, I think you'd be looking at anything from 6% upwards to whatever. It's quite a good way of gaining some revenue and having a home.
So yeah, a great way to have a business and a home all sort of rolled into one, in a sense, but not to underestimate the work involved. And also, I always think, you know, really think hard and long about if you're the sort of person who can keep a smile on your face all the time.
That's absolutely crucial. I think that's absolutely crucial, which is why we moved after 10 years from doing that. Yes, it can be a challenge at times.
But it can also be very rewarding.
Absolutely great fun.
Lovely. Okay, thank you. Peter, someone else has asked, they say they're relocating permanently in the summer. How long can they continue on a UK payroll before having to switch over and become liable for French tax?
An interesting question, in as much as moving to France and still being on a UK payroll is generally not recommended at all. The background to that is, were the French authorities to become aware, they could actually say that you have been or established a French subsidiary or a business activity linked to the UK company. This in itself then has quite serious potential implications on your current employer, in as much as they could be forced to establish a French payroll system. But worse still is that the French authorities might then go to your employer in the UK and request employer social charges. Now, these are quite onerous, and therefore I'm assuming any employer in the UK would be completely unwilling to be sort of having to cope with that huge liability unknowingly. So the key message is, don't do it for very long, or it's not, it could really be a really serious problem. And I think the key message, if there is the view that you're looking at wanting to have a continued activity with your employer in some format having to move, is that you're going to be needing to go to an accountant here in France and establish a form of French business activity, and then work with your employer on a consultancy basis to enable you to perhaps still continue to work with them, but avoiding the employer being caught with a huge social charges liability.
Yeah, absolutely. And also that employer could fall under French employment laws, couldn't they, which are quite different to the UK. So
yeah, as they say, general recommendation is not to.
Great. Okay, then. Diana, on the visas subject, there's a minimum income level required, and a few people have asked what that is. And someone else has said they want to apply for a work visa. Can they list all their potential income sources to make up the required amount? For example, could projected gîte rental income be included?
It's a very good question and a very contradictory question in so many ways for so many people. Unfortunately, a gîte business is not something, a potential gîte business is not something that at the visa center they're looking at as a potential income right now. What they are looking at is that what do you have on the day when you are applying. And when we are talking about what do you have, there is the official communication that comes from the French government. And obviously it's important to follow that one. However, there is the other side with the reality, what happens actually during the visa interview. Therefore, when we are looking at when somebody is moving, higher costs are always occurring when you are in a bigger city. It is definitely cheaper when you are living in smaller villages, for example. But just to be on the safe side, our advice would be that if you can do that, try to please present at least the equivalent amount of the French minimum wage, the gross amount of it, and then you should be absolutely safe. But no, unfortunately, the gîte rental business, the projected gîte rental business is not going to be taken into account.
Lovely. So you actually have to prove that you have that income then and there. You can't say hoping to, you know, work as this or that and get
no, they are actually asking for 3 months worth of bank statement. So okay. It's not possible.
Thank you, Diana. Pauline, a property question now. Which areas in France are best for investment and which areas offer the cheapest properties? People are always looking for a bargain, but investment too.
Everyone's looking for a bargain. The two don't necessarily go together, is what I would say. Just because a particular department may be less expensive than another, doesn't necessarily mean that it would be a good investment. It could just be that there's no real economy around there, there's not a lot going on, and so therefore less popular. Again, do your research. I genuinely can't stress this enough for anybody looking to come over here. And it depends on whether you're price driven, if you're driven by location, if you're driven by climate, all of them make a difference. If you are looking for an investment, then maybe, be looking at something that's a larger town, up and coming places or coastal places, Montpellier being a good example there of investment. But again, back to properties that have good transport links, so that when you come to sell in 5, 10, whatever many years down the line, that it will open up the market to other French potential buyers and not necessarily selling again to international buyers. Be guided by the estate agent, because she'll always have, or he will always have, be able to try to ensure that you pay a fair price from the beginning, and they'll help you with your area search as well and choice.
Lovely. And generally speaking, the cheapest areas of France tend to be more central in the sort of old Limousin region, places like that, don't they, in the Auvergne, where they're cheaper for a reason, because the transport links aren't so good, there's not work opportunities and so on, which is fantastic for those people looking for the great outdoors and peace and quiet. They can find those properties, but don't necessarily expect, I would say to people, don't necessarily expect property prices to go up hugely, especially in those areas in France. They often stay quite level, don't they?
Absolutely do. And I would say almost, the opposite of that for where we live down here in the Aude, that because of the proximity to Spain, to the Mediterranean, to the Pyrenees and the mountains, the prices are held quite well down here. So we might be one of the slightly more expensive departments, but with, it's all those factors plus the climate, which is a massive one, that draws people down here.
Yeah, and also you could look at somewhere like in the Alps, where property is very expensive in those key resorts, but you can also make a lot of money back on rentals, and they hold their price. So really, again, research, I think, definitely really look into it well. Okay, thank you very much, Pauline. So where am I? What questions have we got now? Sorry, I've lost my place in the questions. I don't want to ask you a question I've already asked. So, Peter, a tax one. What property taxes are payable, and how do people register for and pay them? Are there any reductions if you don't spend much time at your house in a year, say if it's a holiday home? And how are those taxes calculated?
Okay, well, there's lots of parts to the question there, but let's keep it nice and simple as a reply. In general, there are 2 standard property taxes. The first one is really simple to explain, called tax habitation. And why it's simple to explain is it's largely being removed. It's already been removed for most of the French population, and the latest budget is indicating that it will be completely removed by the 2023 tax year. So in the near future, nobody will be paying tax habitation. So that's an easy one. The other one is called tax foncière. And I know Pauline indicated this particular one earlier in relationship to purchasing of a property. Tax foncière, by its definition, is a property owner's tax. And it's probably akin to, as you say, the UK council tax in many ways. It funds local services. How it's actually calculated in terms of the liability or the bill is actually based upon the rentable value of the property. And that rentable value of the property is based on an assessment that takes into lots of different factors, numbers of rooms, outbuildings, other permanent structures and alike, including, what people do forget sometimes, if you have an in-ground swimming pool, it increases the rentable value of the assessment. So that in itself increases the tax foncière. There are some basic credits available for new builds, but in general, that's the general principle on how it's paid and how it's calculated. So there will be considerable differences between properties sitting next to each other purely and simply because of what features they have that are forming part of the assessment. And again, it goes back to what Sir Pauline mentioned earlier. How is it actually registered and paid for? Well, in general terms, as he indicated earlier, the actual notaire on the completion purchase of the property will be actually undertaking a re-registration of ownership, at which point there will be a potential refund paid to the existing owner because it's paid in advance. Thereafterwards, you become liable for the payment going forward from the 1st of January each year, but you will be automatically registered on the local system at the time of purchase. And that's the basic two.
Great, thank you very much. It's now time for our second poll, coming up on your screens now. There we go. Well, Diana, someone's asked us, I'm looking to retire to France. I currently work as a writer stroke editor. It's not me. Would a retirement visa allow for some part-time editorial work, or would it make sense to get a work visa straight away?
To be able to work as a writer or editor, the most suitable business setup would be to be here in France, actually, and to be able to work here in France and to be able to invoice from here in France. Unfortunately, you will need to get the right type of visa. Therefore, you will need to have a work visa.
Okay, thank you. And Pauline, how long does it normally take to get planning permission to build in France? And this person has asked, is it quicker to buy a plot of land with a derelict property on it and then put forward planning permission for a new build?
I don't think it would be quicker. I think you would end up with a property that was completely to your liking. Certainly the planning process can be lengthy in France. Normally you'd be looking at about 3 months for planning. Sometimes it can be longer if you made modifications along the way, or if it's near a listed building and other authorities have to be involved. There is, if you see a property that you like but you'd want to make a few tweaks to it, that's slightly different. You could submit, so if you wanted to add a pool or you wanted to add an extension, one of the things that you can do that will give you a fairly speedy response is to speak to the mairie and submit a certificate urbanisme. And with that, normally you get a reply within a month, and that will tell you whether you're likely to get planning permission. So that's not saying you can get it, but the chances are if they're giving their immediate approval that it would go through. So you would still need to go through the more formalised route, but you know quite quickly whether you're in with a good chance for it. So that might be an option. And then again, if you are doing buying a piece of land and building, I think it would be the same the world over. Finding good artisans and tradesmen is always a challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. And presumably people, you know, if you're buying a plot of land, makes sense to check that it does have that outline planning permission. There are English speaking planning permission experts in France who can help people as well, aren't there? So
there's absolutely quite a lot of help from organisations that can help you with that. And again, the agent would be able to help you with somebody locally and usually has a contact who's bilingual. And
for a new build house, people can obviously go to a builder who specialises in new build.
Absolutely. And almost buy one off the peg as well, you know, can happen.
Lots of options then. Great, thank you very much. Peter, could you explain the IGF wealth tax in more detail? Is there any grace given before the IGF becomes payable if you own a home in the UK and France? And do you still have to pay it if you're not French resident?
Okay, let's start off with the position of you're a French resident, and at which point then wealth tax becomes payable if you have property wealth in excess of the threshold, which is 1.3 million net. What we mean by net is if you have mortgages, it can help reduce the value in the calculation. The other key point with regards of it, the main residence in France is deemed to be your principal residence, and it therefore benefits a 30% reduction for calculation purposes. So if having taken all those allowances and deductions into account, if you have a net value therefore of more than 1.3 million, you have a wealth tax liability. Unfortunately, the actual tax liability starts backdated in value essentially, because the first band is from 800,000 to 1.3 million, where it is a tax liability at 0.5% on that base value on that band. Beyond there, 1.3 to just over 2 for about 2.6 million thereabouts, it increases to 0.7 and increasing exponentially on bands above that. So it can actually be quite an expensive liability going forward, depending upon your value. Importantly, for the first 5 years of residency, you only have to include the French situ property. So anybody who's owning UK properties or properties elsewhere in the world do not have to include them for the first 5 years. Beyond the 5th anniversary, they are, however, then included as part of the calculation. The other thing to not forget is it doesn't just include pure bricks and mortar property. There's also indirect property that can be included as parts of the calculation. Trusts that hold a property, also investment funds that you might have a property fund that is invested largely in property, unfortunately can be included as parts of the calculation. So just in slight difference then, if you're a non-resident, the question, unfortunately, yes is the answer. You still have a wealth tax liability if you own a French property in excess of 1.3 million. The negative is because it's not your main and principal residence, you don't benefit the 30% discount either. So it can be quite a bill if you are non-resident. So taking a step back though, I think what you have to consider is a really important question. And that's about, is retaining portfolios of property, which is a fairly common trait that occurs a lot with people in the UK, a reasonable thing to do on moving to France, particularly if it's then going to start causing you perhaps quite a significant wealth tax liability at some point down the road. So that's the basics of it.
Great, thanks, Peter. Diana, what about working in France? We've been asked what would be the best option? One, be self-employed in the UK and work remotely based in France, or two, set up as a freelancer in France?
It's a very good question. It depends if you're planning to do business with French companies. It depends on where your business is taking place, where are your clients. As Peter already mentioned, it all depends on the taxation as well. So it's usually which one works best for you. But it's very a common question, hence why we have a lot of clients who are going for example, a business consultation, because when you are moving, all these questions are, figuring it out all by yourself is not easy. But, discuss with as many people, as many experts as you can, because they can really help you to figure out what would be the best option.
Great, thank you, Diana. And Pauline, we've been asked which documents need to be translated into French for a property purchase, and how do you find an approved translator?
Most good estate agents will normally have a list of notaires that they use that are bilingual in order to avoid having to have any documents translated at all. We have a list, certainly for where I am down here, we have a list of notaires that we regularly use, who we know are good, who we know are bilingual, and they've never required of anything to be translated. Occasionally, if there was something for whatever reason, then it's easy enough via social media groups or speaking to the agent, and they would be able to help you with that. Again, speaking for our company, the agents, the vast majority are the minimum of bilingual, so would be able to help with things. But yeah, again, take advice from your agent, because I suspect you wouldn't need it, because you could have them with a bilingual notaire, and it would be fine.
Great, thank you, Pauline. Peter, will social charge tax still be paid by British second homeowners?
Not in the same way that it used to, is the answer. Let's go back and what that basically means. Up until not so many years ago, non-residents selling a French property that had a gain were paying social charges as part of the calculation. That, however, was challenged in the European courts under what became known as the Reuter ruling, which effectively said the French had no right to apply social charges on non-residents because they weren't affiliated to the French health system. So far, so good. The problem occurs, though, and the sting of the tail is that the French looked at this and actually changed the rules. And effectively, they introduced a new type of tax. And we mentioned this tax earlier called the solidarity tax, and this is where this comes into. It's effectively because this particular tax doesn't fund the social security system, it funds the general tax pool. And as a consequence, it enabled the French then to apply this new solidarity tax at 7.5% going forward on anybody having a gain selling as a non-resident. So yes and no, but it's a different format.
Okay, thanks, Peter. Diana, do you need to be a resident ahead of time to enrol children in local schools?
First of all, I think it's quite important to know that children, they do not need a residency permit. However, they need a visa. And for the visa, often one of the requirements are a pre-enrollment school certificate. So it's kind of like a catch-22 in a certain way. Private schools are obviously happy to provide with this certificate. However, if you plan to enroll your child into a public school, you definitely have to have an address here in France because enrollments are based on the address of where you are living. So yes and no in a certain way.
Okay, thank you. Pauline, we've been asked, are notaires a good source of finding a French property? So in France, agents and notaires are allowed to sell property, aren't they?
Yes, yes, they can. They don't have the same perhaps reach and depth of knowledge that a good estate agent would have. And we probably tend to have more varied and a greater number of properties on our books in our portfolio than a notaire would. So it would be up to the individual to choose how they did it and see what they can find.
Okay, great. Peter, is it possible to have a consultancy business registered in the UK but be permanently domiciled in France?
The answer is yes, it's perfectly possible. The difficulty is about the tax implications. And as much as if any part of this consultancy activity is actually physically undertaken from here in France, which would be the indication from the question, it would in fact mean that they ought to be running that part of the activity within a French business activity and paying French taxes on it. So whilst it's possible, the advice I would suggest here is that they need to see an accountant to actually look at what options are available in terms of operating it within a French business activity, because there are numerous types and it would be appropriate to take advice on as to which might be the most suitable for the individual.
Great, okay, thank you very much. Diana, we've been asked, what visas would an American and British couple need to live in France?
There's actually no difference between the two passports. They are both non-European passport holders, so they have access to the same type of visa. So there is no difference.
There's a good quick answer. A lot of people asking from America about visas, but the process is the same for everyone, is it?
It's the same rules and regulations. That the difference are very, very slightly about the application process. Just to make it fun for Americans, they can smile on the ID picture, but they have to show their ears. Brits, they cannot smile and they cannot show their ears. So
okay, I didn't know that about the ears. Okay, so thank you. Pauline, one for you. Somebody's asked, what's the best way, while still based in the UK, to find a rental property in France, just to cover the gap between completion of the sale on a UK home and the purchase of a new home in France?
Plenty of websites offering accommodation that you could access from the UK without any problem. There's social media groups that may be able to help. So for example, again, where I am, there's lots of small groups around where you could ask for services, or people would be offering certain services, such as renting out a gîte. Your local agent might have contact. The only thing I would say is that if you are looking to rent in the summer whilst you're waiting for a purchase to go through, it is going to cost you more, because you're probably going to be paying the full rate that a gîte owner would expect for a holiday rental. So again, just think about timings. And in terms of working towards completion, again, we as agents, we try to keep both parties, the vendor and the buyer, heavily involved and link with the notaire to organise the best approach for dates and completions to try and keep everybody as happy as we can.
Lovely. And often the agent who you're using to buy a property can help you find a rental property too, can't they, in cases?
Yeah, sometimes, absolutely. We have a few little contacts occasionally.
Yeah, so normally it's worth asking there as well. Okay, lovely. Peter, another tax question here. What considerations should property buyers make with regards to eventually passing the property on, especially for non-married couples or people with stepchildren? I think you touched on this earlier, but yeah, what about non-married couples?
It's a great question and very complicated at the start point, because let's be looking at it. Non-married couples, stepchildren, without doing something, the liability is at 60%. One for the survivor of the non-married couple and equally the stepchild potentially. So there's a huge liability involved without doing planning. So the starting point is one, being aware of the problem, but thereafterwards actually putting down, well, what is it you're looking at wanting to try and achieve? Key, because there is no simple answer and there's no utopia, but it's about putting down and then seeking advice, because there are numerous potential solutions that can help. And it depends upon where you are, if residents or non-residents, but just a very brief summary. It might mean for those that aren't married to look to formalize their relationship to avoid the tax liability. It might include, if you haven't bought the property, to include a tontine clause in the purchase contract, ensuring the wills are correctly drawn up to ensure that they go to the right people, minimizing tax. Possibilities at looking at how they are married could be fundamental, depending on if it's not just stepchildren, as another possibility. And that's all just linked to the property. The other key point is, of course, if they then become tax resident of France, it's not just the property in isolation that all these are issues to, it covers all worldwide assets. So you have to extend the options available and solutions to cover worldwide assets that then might also include restructuring financial assets and so forth. So not a straightforward question and no easy answer. And I think the key message is about what is the priorities and then seeking advice in order to what is the best mix of possible solutions to get as close as you can to where you want to be.
Okay, great. And always you need to look at that before you buy a property, not sort of, further down the line. So
and that's particularly true because, as I say, the tontine clause can only be included at the time of purchase in the purchase contract, for example.
Yeah, right. Okie dokie. Wow, this hour has just whizzed by. I think we've got time for another couple of questions before we wrap up. So, Diana, one for you. Someone's asked, I plan to purchase a rural house in Brittany where I need a car. I currently use hire cars, but would like to eventually buy one. As a non-EU, non-French resident, can I still buy and register a car in France?
Yes, they can buy and they can register a car. Obviously, they need to look into the different regulations and laws that applies to certain people, such as having the address, having a driving license, preferably having a residency permit in a certain way. But the easiest option in that sense, usually to buy a used car here in France, because when you're importing the car, you also have to face custom taxes. So, and it comes with all other different administrative matters. Usually in our company, it's Lori who does take care of car registrations, and she really does magic to it. So if there's any further question on that, I'm happy to forward it to her.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Diana. Pauline, we've had quite a lot of questions coming in from Americans and other nationalities asking if they can buy a property in France. As far as I'm aware, there's no restrictions on different nationalities buying properties, are there?
No, there aren't any restrictions, and we've helped many Americans to buy over here and either settle permanently or to purchase a holiday home here. And now that traveling's getting easier, we're getting the interest back again from America after the COVID restrictions. So the market is really is heating up and quite buoyant. The only thing to bear in mind for any Americans is if they do require financing, that might be a slightly different aspect.
Okay, great. Well, that's good to hear. Not about the financing bit, but the fact that all nationalities can buy a property in France, that no one's restricted. Lovely. So yes, we've come up to 3 o'clock. So that's the end of our webinar for today. Thank you everybody for joining us. I do hope it's been useful, but you can also contact any of us afterwards with further questions. Thanks to my fellow panelists, Peter, Diana and Pauline. And thanks also to our sponsor, Blevins Franks. For more information about France and French property, please do visit our websites, which are completefrance.com and francepropertyshop.com. There's also loads of information on there about the subjects we've covered today and about our magazines, French Property News and France Magazine. So please do join us for our next webinar. We'll include the details by email, and you can also find out more on our French Property Exhibitions website. So once again, thank you everybody for joining us. See you next time.